So if I click on the steps segment, you can see that if we use the scroll button on our mouse, we can zoom out or into a composition. And so you can see when I select steps, it highlights the bounding box around that particular object. And I'm going to zoom in just so that you can see the changes in what I have here. So underneath effects and presets, we have a lot of different categories, and they've tried to organize the effects and presets into some different kinds of ways of working. The effects are basically all of these different elements from 3D channel down to utility. And if I use the little disclosure arrow, you can see that there are some different elements there that I can apply. And so these are categories, and then inside each of the categories are the different effects that you can add. The presets are basically combinations of modifications and effects that are designed to create very specific kinds of looks and feels. So here we've got some different kinds of behaviors, drifting and fading and opacity changing. All of these are things that you can create by yourself with using keyframing of different properties inside the composition, and we'll talk more about keyframing later, and a combination of effects. So the animation presets apply a prepackaged combination to an image or a piece of footage or a text element. The nice feature that we have here right at the top is that if we type in a word, then we can search through the effects and presets and actually concentrate on some of the different sort of blurs that we have here. And so I'm going to, let's see, we'll apply a radial blur to my composition here. And you can see that as I move over the different elements, it highlights each of the pieces and lets me decide if I want to apply a blur to the background or the tennis ball or our individual figures here. I'm going to apply it to the background just so that we can see what happens, and now they look like they're lost in space. And the other thing that happens is that in addition to changing the look over here, we're also opening up the effect controls, which is behind the project. And this is where we can actually make some adjustments to the way that this particular effect is modifying our footage, or in this case, our Photoshop layer. If I move the slider back a little bit, you can see it decreases the amount of the radial blur. If I move it up, you can see that it increases it and makes it almost unrecognizable. We also can change the amount value by moving the mouse over our amount number, and then it turns into an arrow that lets us scroll up and down. We can also click to activate the numerical value here, and I can type in a number and hit return or enter, and then it applies that particular effect too. Here I can change the center value, so all of the different sort of parameters that can be modified for all of these effects will pop up underneath our effect controls. They will also pop up underneath our element in the timeline. And so you can do the modification in the timeline, you can do the modification in the effect controls. It's completely up to you and what you're more comfortable in working with. There are a lot of different parameters for all of the different kinds of effects, and whichever one you choose is going to have a different set over here, and we're just kind of showing you the samples here. The point I want you to pay attention to, though, is this little stopwatch that's over here on the far left hand side of each of the different elements. And what that does is that tells me that all of these properties are something that we can modify over time, and that's basically the key to After Effects, is the power to be able to modify things over time. And so this is just something to keep in mind as we move forward. So we won't go into a whole lot of the details here, but you can just kind of see the changes as they're being made. So you can see that we have our effects down here in our timeline, and you can see that we also have the option for transform, and this is something that's automatically added to each of our different elements inside our timeline. I'm just going to go ahead and select our Gary 2 over here on the left-hand side of our composition and activate his transform values. And you can see that we've got anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. And these are elements that are automatically going to be attached to anything visible inside your composition. So if you create a text file, it's going to be there. If you bring in an image, if you bring in footage, they'll also have these. And we'll be able to make some modifications. And the anchor point is basically the center point by default of the visual element. And so here you can see that our anchor point, if you see the little highlight there, and we're going to change the color of this to, let's change it to pink so that you can see what it is there. Maybe we'll change it to yellow. Yellow is a little bit brighter. Okay, so we've got the, and we'll use the space bar to activate the hand tool, and you can see that we've got the anchor point there in the center of the object. And the anchor point comes into play for a couple of different reasons. In terms of what else is here in the transform, the anchor point is the point that we rotate around. Okay, so you can see the piece there. We'll just go back to 0. And we'll go back to 0. Okay. If I change the position of the anchor point so that you can see that here the anchor point is actually staying in the same place as far as I see it, but we're changing the X and Y values. So now if the anchor point is centered on his face, if I change the rotation value, we're going to rotate around his face instead. And so you can see where that might have an impact on some of the different things that you're doing. Now the position is, we're going to zoom out here a little bit. The position is going to be the placement of the element within the overall composition. And so here we've got an XY coordinate. This is why geometry is important. And if I change the X value, you can see that he moves from left to right. If I change the Y value, he moves from top to bottom. And so I can make changes to his position by moving my mouse over the values here, or I can also click on him and pick him up and move him over. And it really depends on your composition and the way that you like to work, which method you want to work with. If I click on reset, it's going to bring him back to the center and have everything sort of in their default settings. With scale, we can zoom in and zoom out, and you can see that he flips upside down if we go too far there. We'll talk more about all of the different kinds of things to do with that later. But right now, the proportions of the X and Y scale are locked. If I wanted to unlock them, then that means that those proportions are no longer constrained together. And if I change the X value, he's wider now than he is tall. So you can see some of the differences there, and hopefully you can imagine how some of these things can be useful as you're working. So if I like that proportion, I can go back, and now you can see that if I move one, the other moves, but they're also not the same. So if I want to fix that, I can go back in and type it in. And usually if you're going for precision, typing is the way to go. It's also useful to be able to select things from here, especially if you have a composition that has many layers. Sometimes they'll all look even the same. We've talked about the rotation. We have degrees, and then we have number of rotations. So here we've got the degrees in terms of those 360, and you can see that as we go up over 360, it includes, or it brings up the 1 time. We'll reset these. If I just want to say that it rotates multiple times, then I can use the that first value there. But these are things that are certainly more interesting as you modify them over time. But I just want to show you how they work. And so we can change the opacity of the object. So lots of different kinds of things that we can do inside our transform properties. And again, these time vary stopwatches to the left of each of the different properties here indicates that we can change those over time.